And from screenwriter David Kep of Jurassic Park.
For me, it was an intriguing chance to do a superhero story, which I'd never done.
Comes an adventure story about a crime-fighting figure masked in shadow who operates outside the law. A mysterious lone avenger with the power to cloud men's minds.
The Shadow. The Shadow.
What evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows.
Sorry to interrupt, boys.
The Shadow.
Yes, the Shadow.
Out over the cold hills to the state's prison.
Shadow comes for revenge.
The computer's going to tell us who the Shadow is.
The Shadow knows.
Surely you're not afraid of death.
Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows.
Agents of the Shadowcast report for the only podcast on the internet devoted exclusively to the immortal exploits of the Dark Avenger of the pulps, comics, films, and more, The Shadow. I realize that it has been quite a long time since the last Shadowcast, and the simplest explanation is I couldn't cover this entertainment property because I was making a few of my own. I've had 2 books published in the interim, both of which have been successful beyond my wildest imaginings, with the latest, the slightly Shadow-inspired Western comic book, The Ghost of the Badlands, kind of a pulpy, gothic Western comic book. That one being even more successful. We had a massively successful Indiegogo campaign, raised over $250,000 on that crazy thing, and it's still selling on Amazon, topping out in a number of categories on that platform. Just wild. So yeah, the last year has been very, very busy for me on the creative front. And it's wild because I feel like you get lulled into sort of a false sense of security. I live and breathe the Shadow all the time. I've always got a Shadow pulp on my nightstand or a comic or something. So I kind of live and breathe it all the time. And unfortunately, the sad side effect of that is that you just sort of think that you could just, anytime you feel like it, turn on a microphone and record a Shadowcast episode. But of course, it doesn't really work like that. You have to put in the work. You have to make sure that it's of a certain quality. That means you have to do the research. I had to refresh my memory, because today's episode is not just long overdue because it's been like a year since the last episode. It's long overdue because we are finally going to talk about and review and analyze the making of the 1994 Shadow film. The theme of this season of the Shadowcast is The Shadow on film. And what better way to begin that season than with what is, in my mind, the wildly underrated 1994 Universal Shadow film, a film with perhaps one of the most beleaguered production histories in the history of Hollywood. And honestly, you never hear it discussed among such companies like Dune or other tortured productions that took a long, long time to get on the silver screen. Folks, Walter Gibson was aware of the production of this film before he died.
Report.
From producer Martin Bregman.
Batman, Spider-Man, they all followed the Shadow. The Shadow really was the prototype. He was the first anti-hero in pop American literature. There's a vestige of evil in him. There's a vestige of danger in him. That's what makes him a lot more interesting than all of the other characters that followed. It took me 12 years to make it.
He famously sort of prophesied before his death, sadly at the age of 88, I think, in 1985. He prophesied to Will Murray that, I think this production's going to last a little bit longer than I will. And sadly, it turned out to be correct. Of course, This is a very significant event. The creation and release of the 1994 Shadow film is significant not just because of how prominent it was. I mean, they had a whole action figure campaign that I remember vividly. Not just because it introduced many of us to the character. I'm unashamed to admit it's what introduced me to the Shadow. I was too young to go into theaters and watch it, right? By 1994 is a PG-13 movie, so I was not of age. I was a little kid. But I do remember the television advertisements and the toy advertisements and just being entranced.
Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men?
The Shadow knows.
Armed with quick-draw 45s, the mysterious crime fighter faces the evil Shawan Khan, now ready for battle. But Shadow's hypno-eyes cloud men's minds.
You will obey. I will obey.
But Khan escapes on his serpent bike.
After him, Shadow.
Khan fires first. Shadow cycle pops a wheelie, launching a counter-missile. Each sold separately.
Into the room, Khan.
Or is it? Who knows? The Shadow knows.
To the point that I wound up dressing as the Shadow for Halloween in 1994 or 5. I used to dress up as the Shadow all the time. He's just kind of been a fixture in my life, but I knew very little about the character except what I had seen in commercials. I hadn't seen the movie, and indeed, I wouldn't watch the movie until much later in life. But it's more significant than just on that level. It's actually significant because I've mentioned in the past when I talked about the possible Shadow Amazon series in development, the Doc Savage series that actually is confirmed to be in development, that Condé Nast have this pattern to their production where before they release something, they like to kind of have all their ducks in a row. So they wait for a movie or a game or whatever to come out, and then they just release as much product on that property as possible. So whenever the Doc Savage movie gets out of development hell, we'll probably get a bunch of re-releases of all the Doc Savage pulps and comics and all of that stuff, right? And if the next Shadow movie ever happens, probably the same thing will happen, because that's exactly what occurred with the 94 Shadow film.
That Shadow serial is coming back to theaters this summer, while tapes of the original radio show keep it alive. And after all, it is radio that made the Shadow a permanent fixture in American popular culture.
Walter Gibson was bemoaning before his untimely death. Untimely just because we never wanted him to die. Yes, I realize he was 88 years old. He was knocking on the door of 90, but that man should have lived to 1,000. But he was bemoaning before his death that they had not gotten this movie out. Not because he wanted to see it, although he did plan to have a cameo at some point, but because he wanted to reprint the Shadow pulps. And he wanted to write introductions and talk about, he wanted to write little stuff about how the stories were written. And so, I mean, we missed out on all that stuff. But Condé Nast wouldn't put it in print because they were waiting for the movie to come out. They were planning to release all the Shadow pulps after that movie came out, expecting there would be a wave of Shadow popularity. Indeed, the Shadow film from 94 was expected to kick off sort of a new Shadow renaissance. It was supposed to be a wave of media. And you can see that in their behavior leading up to it. They got a new company. They gave them the license to print the comics. That, of course, was Dark Horse. They took the license away from first DC, then Marvel, then DC again, and then gave it over to Dark Horse, who held the license to the Shadow, I believe, for the duration of the 1990s. That's all an indication that, hey, we're planning kind of a new wave of Shadow media. They, of course, greenlit and produced the Shadow video game for the Super Nintendo, which is a superb beat-em-up, actually, and sadly went unreleased. Although you can play what is basically a finished game. It was leaked years ago. Ocean, I believe, produced that game, and I have streamed it live on my other channel. It is pretty well known now, but it was just never released. I think that's ridiculous, by the way. Kind of demonstrates an ignorance of how important video games were on Condé Nast's part, because I don't think they realized at that point, as perhaps a lot of media companies didn't realize, that you can actually give your franchise a new life by just releasing a halfway decent video game, even if your movie bombed, which The Shadow, for the record, did not bomb. It was just sort of a middling, mediocre success, which was not what Universal were looking for. But nevertheless, it sort of got canceled after that. I mean, but this is all part of that wave of media. Indeed, they were patterning it after Batman in a lot of ways. In fact, that has been pretty much acknowledged by everybody involved in this production. Universal were looking at the success of Superman and Batman and some of the other properties that had come out around this time and saying to themselves, ooh, we got to get in on that. So they were trying to make their own version of Batman. The difference was, for whatever reason, after the success of Jurassic Park, you've got the writer of Jurassic Park, David Koepp. He's riding high, not just off Jurassic Park, but off of Death Becomes Her, which was also critically acclaimed. So he's kind of riding high at that point. For some reason, kind of a shoestring budget for this movie.
We're right about at the dawn of modern CGI, I think, and later on people would just completely crush that with films like Jurassic Park and so forth. This was not a film that had that technology, nor did they have the budget for that technology. So they had to make it more clever than more computer-generated effect.
We were on the cusp of the CG revolution. There's an old-fashioned sense to the movie in that the emphasis is, heavily on story and character, and the effects are largely practical.
They've got I think the real juxtaposition here, and maybe what hampers the movie at the end of the day, is too much ambition for too little cash. It was sort of a low-budget Batman, and it shows in places, especially if you have the Blu-ray. You'll notice just seams in the Shadow's makeup, for example. At the very end of the movie, you get this close-up shot of the Shadow's face, and you can literally see the mesh on the hairpiece eyebrows that they gave him. I still have no idea why they did that to the eyebrows. It's so weird. The makeup job was very odd. It's not terrible, although when he takes the mask off, apparently the Shadow's power is to turn from Alec Baldwin into Billy Baldwin, because that's basically all that happens. Let me just out with it before we talk about, sort of go scene by scene and talk about the plot and all of that stuff. I love this movie. I unabashedly defend it. If this review had a headline on it, it would be, man, it could have been so much worse. Like, we could have received so much less faithful of an adaptation than we received. I feel like some Shadow fans somewhat exaggerate the degree to which this movie was unfaithful, because, folks, there were so many things in this movie that were just ripped right from the pulps and didn't need to be. They could have gone completely into business for themselves, but they didn't. We get Wainwright Barth as police commissioner. Like, they don't even go with the obvious choice, which is Weston.
He should have been the Shadow. Would have been quite a different Shadow, I think, don't you?
Huge shadow.
Would have been an enormous Shadow.
It's all right. Cloudbursts aren't small.
It would have been a huge cumulonimbus Shadow.
Please, those college words.
And that's straight from the pulps. Like, where are you getting that name from, except if you're reading the pulps? They clearly read the pulps. They mentioned Joe Cardona at one point.
Well, what's going on?
Inspector Cardona's in charge, sir. He's over there.
They mentioned, I mean, these guys had clearly consulted the actual source material. We get the agents of the Shadow.
Don't ever take it off.
Wait a minute. Who are you?
Somebody who owes him his life. Somebody just like you.
We get essentially a replication, albeit a somewhat streamlined one, of the recruitment of Harry Vincent from the Living Shadow, only instead of Harry Vincent, we put Roy Tam, who is also a character from the pulps. We put him as the surrogate for Harry Vincent, who sadly is not in this movie.
I've saved your life, Roy Tam. It now belongs to me. It does?
We get Andre Gregory, who's a film legend, as Burbank, which is inspired.
Report.
Our agent in 26th Precinct reports police investigation of murder at Museum of Natural History.
Murder.
Agent advises inquiry.
Understood.
He is the perfect Burbank, and not enough people mention it. I love the cast in this movie. That would definitely be one of the main things that I would compliment about this. I mean, think about this. You get Alec Baldwin, Penelope Ann Miller. You get Tim Curry. You get Peter Boyle, for crying out loud. You get John Lone. You get Ian McKellen. I mean, you just... it was an embarrassment of riches with this cast. In fact, there's a few bit parts here and there where I was like, is that? And it did. I looked up on IMDb and they were famous actors. And it makes you wonder because this generation of actors, especially some of the older actors who were in this movie, would have grown up in the era when the Shadow was dominating the airwaves, and the second coming of the Shadow radio show in the 1960s and 70s. So it makes you wonder if the ensemble is not so stacked with famous actors and actresses because they requested to be in the movie and as like a favor, oh yeah, you can be in the Shadow movie. Like as soon as they heard there was a Shadow movie, they were just like, I gotta be in. You wonder. I've received no actual independent confirmation of that, but I would not be surprised at all because the ensemble is just like, how do you waste Ian McKellen on a role that doesn't even have that many lines, especially when he has to do an American accent, which is, I have one gripe about Ian McKellen in this movie. I think he is entertaining and funny. He's kind of playing a comic relief character, but he cannot do an American accent at all. And the problem with this is they should have just steered into that. They should have just let him do his English accent, now that I think about it. And then, of course, the solution to that is he's supposed to be Margot Lane's dad in this. He's like a nuclear scientist. What they should have done is let him have his British accent. English accent. I apologize to European Shadow fans on that slip. But let him have his English accent, and then Margot Lane could have a transatlantic accent. Yeah, like an American accent, but a little bit Britified, right? Just a little bit, because that would fit the time period anyway. That's how society women like Margot Lane would have spoke at the time. Really, if we're going to critique this movie, I think you have to start right at the beginning. And that is with the origin. Now, this is not a bad origin. I want to make this perfectly clear. It was good enough for Christopher Nolan to steal for Batman Begins. I mean, watch this. Watch Batman Begins and then go back and watch the introduction of this movie. You'll be like, what's going on? It's done well. It's acted well. The tongue is firmly in the cheek from scene number 1, but there's a lavishness to the production that seems to have a little bit more weight than sometimes the performances decide to go with. Look, I get it. It's 1994. Superhero movies are anything but bankable. Even Batman 89 had a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, especially when you got a villain in the Joker. Batman Returns, even though it was darker, was arguably even more tongue-in-cheek and even more camp in some ways. So obviously, the first instinct of a lot of actors and actresses coming into this project is going to be, campify it up. You can't take this too seriously or the audiences are going to laugh at it.
I think that Our Shadow is a combination of the cartoon and magazine artwork. I mean, as far as the look, you want to be faithful to that. But as far as the flavor and the style of it, I think you want it to be very much like the radio show, where it's a little campy, and it has its tongue a little bit in its cheek.
But the truth is, there's enough humor in the script already with characters like Tim Curry's character and Ian McKellen's character.
Dr. Lane, you don't think big. If you'd only listen to me, the world could be our oyster.
Oysters? I get a rash from oysters.
And even with some of the screwball comedy stuff that you get with Penelope Ann Miller and Alec Baldwin, which I think is some of the most memorable dialogue in the movie.
Do yourself a favor. Stay away from her. She's strange. She hears voices.
Really?
People say they have no chemistry, and those people are absolutely indefatigably incorrect. They have some of the only truly memorable exchanges in the entire movie. Like, some of the Shadow's dialogue is not that memorable, but the Shadow and Margot Lane is instantly memorable. I thought they nailed all that stuff, and Penelope Ann Miller is an absolute goddess in this movie. I know some Shadow fans aren't big fans of non-brunette Margot Lane, but I don't know, blonde Margot Lane has always worked for me.
My character is Margot Lane, and she's sort of a society girl, and she goes to these clubs. Lamont Cranston sees me and is immediately sort of drawn to me, and we sort of lock eyes. It's a really fun scene because it's sort of every actress's dream to have sort of this grand entrance in a movie and to be wearing these beautiful gowns and really look so glamorous.
So the opening here with the origin of Ying Ko, it's fine on its own in another movie for another character. In a Shadow movie, though, I don't think it needs to be here. I don't think you need that tortured soul. And that really brings us to sort of the formative error from which all other errors flow in this movie. And that is, David Koepp is a fine writer, and I think he wrote a fine script. And some of the scenes that were actually cut out of the movie, I think would have made it even better. Some of those you can actually read in the comic book adaptation by Michael Kaluta. Those definitely would have improved the movie. But even then, there's a misinterpretation of the import of the character. Look, I get what they were going for. They were going for pathos, right? How does the Shadow know what evil lurks in the hearts of men? They literally say this. Every behind-the-scenes making of video, every featurette, every press kit, they all say this. The Shadow knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men because the Shadow has that evil in himself. He has come from an evil background.
The Shadow knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men. If he's going to know about evil, he must have had some experience with it himself. And that was where the idea came to tell this backstory of him in Tibet and what his unsavory origins were.
And so that's where this Ying Ko background comes from. The problem, of course, with this is, guys, we already have pathos in the Shadow mythos. Nothing quite ties a bow on this malady like the exchange between, I think it's, what's he called? The Tolku, right? The weird monk kid who has superpowers, teaches him all of his shadow abilities. When he's talking to him about the evil in his heart, and he's essentially pronouncing a moral judgment on Lamont Cranston.
You know what evil lurks in the hearts of men, for you have seen that evil in your own heart. Every man pays the price for redemption. This is yours.
I'm not looking for redemption.
You have no choice. You will be redeemed.
And of course, Shadow fans already know what's wrong with this scene. That's the Shadow's job. That is not the Tolku's job. The Shadow's primary function in all of his stories, even in the radio show, even in the Orson Welles radio show, which is somewhat gimped from the pulp version, is to be like the great chorus, the voice of morality, the voice of judgment.
You have defiled man's noblest profession. You have brought death with the skill meant to save life. You have struck like a human vampire in this great sanitarium, this sanctuary of the sick. And you are going to pay for it with death.
Right? The sort of divine retribution. So by making this the story of a tortured Shadow character, instead of giving us a proxy hero who's up front that we could follow around, who could be more tortured, and the Shadow pronounces a judgment on that person and shows that person how to redeem themselves as they're overcoming the threat of Shiwan Khan. I mean, that's obviously the proper pulpy Shadow version of the movie script that we should have had. We get this, the Shadow is kind of moping around, I don't trust myself. We get this several cringy lines in that connection. We also get some funny scenes, right? Like,
what did you dream?
I was lying naked on the beach in the South Seas. And the tide was coming up over my toes. What was yours?
I dreamed I tore all the skin off my face and was somebody else underneath.
You have problems.
That was pretty cool. You know, though, you get those kind of humorous exchanges. Like I said, there is chemistry between Penelope Ann Miller and Alec Baldwin in this movie. I think they save a lot of scenes, frankly, that otherwise would be cringe. But one scene they can't save is the one where Margot Lane says, you know, she's kind of hinting that she wants to stay the night. And she says, I'm not afraid of you.
I'm not afraid of you.
But I am.
Like, the Shadow's not afraid of the Shadow. You have no idea what and it sucks because they sort of, the script contains vestiges of, I don't know if it's an earlier draft or whatever, but they're hints of what they could have done. For example, in the scene in the Cobalt Club, where Wainwright Barth meets with Lamont Cranston, and he sits down, and Wainwright Barth is reading him the riot act.
I'm sorry, what were we talking about?
You know, I've never meddled in your affairs. Going back to the time that, after the war, when you disappeared for some 7 years. I never asked any questions then. I'm not asking any questions.
Excuse me, please, Commissioner Barth. Urgent message for you, sir.
Thank you.
And it's like, what are you doing, David Koepp? Right there is a chance to have the proper Shadow origin. The Shadow's actual origin is amazing, right? After World War I, he does a bunch of counter-spycraft, and he frees Allied prisoners, and he works for the French, and he works for the Romanovs, and he's a storied World War I. He's basically the Allied version of the Red Baron. Then after the war, his plane goes down in the Yucatan, and all the stuff with the Girasol and all of that. Like, all that stuff is awesome, right? And the movie script hints at it, and then pulls back from the precipice. And no, he was busy being Ying Ko. You see what the problem here is in terms of the structure of the movie? I don't know, if I'm writing a Shadow movie, I'm focusing on the recruitment of Harry Vincent, right? He's the guy you're going to get the pathos from. I mean, you open the story of the Living Shadow with him being ready to commit suicide. How much more pathos could you get? This is a guy who has no money. It's the beginning of the Depression. His woman has left him and gone to marry another man. He's ready to jump off a bridge. And then a nebulous hand emerges from the umbral darkness and just snatches him by the lapel of his coat and saves his life and says, "I've saved your life. It belongs to me now." To its credit, and this is what I mean when I compliment this film, it's such a best of times, worst of times. We get that sequence.
You'll become one of my agents, like dozens of others all over the world.
Could I ask my wife about this?
No!
Indeed, right after this introduction, we get, like, really the perfect Shadow sequence.
Did you think you'd get away with it?
Come on, Duke!
Did you think I wouldn't know?
Really, my only critique of this would be there's a pretty big error in it, and any Shadow fan who's seen this any number of times knows what the big error is. But beyond that, the invisibility. I'm not a big fan of the fist fight and the invisibility. I don't think the Shadow even would bother with that. But not the Shadow of the pulps anyways. But of course, the big blunder is when the Shadow sort of reveals himself. He's tormenting these gangsters, and his cackling is reverberating all around the Brooklyn Bridge, or whatever bridge it is. These 30s gangsters are kind of looking for him and shooting their gats at him and trying to hunt him down, and then he just appears behind them. And it's a cool, chilling scene. It's actually well done. But something's missing, right? When the Shadow first emerges and sort of darkens, and you actually see the Shadow begin to sprawl, and the gangsters are looking up at it. It's a really well done shot. You can see that the Shadow's wearing a cape. Even his actual Shadow is wearing a cape. But he's not wearing a cape. He's just wearing a trench coat. Now, we know why this was. And of course, to really call attention to the blunder, after that, we cut to a different sequence, and the Shadow's walking toward the camera, and suddenly he's wearing a cape again. It's a really cool shot, actually. Actually, what happened here is there was supposed to be a CGI cape. They were going to do kind of what they did in the movie, the Spawn film, right? Where the cape was billowing all around, and it was kind of going to have a life of its own. It was going to be like a comic book cape, so they wouldn't have to use wind machines all the time, just to give him that sort of spectral look. I imagine the effect would probably have looked pretty similar to what some of the animated Shadows look like a little bit later in the movie. But we actually get a peek of this. If you watch the music video for Original Sin by Taylor Dane, that of course is the big single that was released in the movie soundtrack to The Shadow. In the music video, you can see the original clip with the CGI cape in it. And by the way, it looks fine. It looks really good. And I am, frankly, to this day, completely baffled that it wasn't used. It makes you wonder if Russell Mulcahy or the producers or whatever just forgot. Because they made the cape, they put it in a shot, and then they put it in the music video, which millions of people watched on MTV repeatedly. And then they don't put it in the movie? And then, just to call attention to the error, they cut to a shot immediately after where he's wearing the cape. It is the most obnoxious thing in the world. It's a really obvious flaw in an otherwise pretty perfect sequence. This whole sequence on the bridge is something right out of the Walter Gibson pulps. It's a little bit Hollywood in places. The invisibility gimmick and all of that stuff is a little bit Hollywood. That certainly is more of a callback to the radio show, and one of many, frankly. That probably really is the fundamental flaw, too. This is not the pulp Shadow. It is the pulp Shadow combined with the comic book Shadow combined with the radio Shadow. And I feel like the filmmakers, for the most part, are a little bit more familiar with the radio version. You can catch it here and there in the dialogue.
It's a vacant lot now, but I want you to find out what used to be there.
Second in Houston. What about Farley Claymore?
Mr. Claymore is going to receive a little visit from the Shadow.
Can I go along?
No. Not this time, Margot. This is a case for the Shadow.
The screwball comedy segments, and indeed that's the verbiage they use to describe this sort of 1930s romantic comedy patter between Margot and Lamont.
She was always sort of one-upping him and being able to complete his sentences. It just reminded me of those great 30s sort of even screwball comedies where they're always talking that sort of quick banter back and forth really fast.
We need each other.
No, we don't.
We have a connection.
No, we don't.
Then how do you explain that I can read your thoughts?
My thoughts are hard to miss.
And why is that?
Psychically, I'm very well endowed.
I'll bet you are.
Those sequences very much come off like some of the patter between Margot and Lamont Cranston, especially during the Bill Johnstone era and certain episodes of the Orson Welles incarnation. But like in the early 40s when Bill Johnstone was doing the show, it very much became kind of, whenever there was a Margot and Lamont segment, it was kind of screwball comedy-ish. They were sort of telling jokes at each other's expense, and Margot was hinting that, you know, hey, you gonna put a ring on it, right? Those kind of exchanges. And it definitely has that vibe to it when you have Margot and Lamont interactions in the movie, which is why I don't mind them. And I think they actually work. It's one of the things that made the radio show work, was that chemistry between Margot and Lamont Cranston. And I don't mind seeing that on the screen. I think for the most part, it works and doesn't intrude on the pulpier elements. But guys, give this movie credit. It has a lot of elements from the pulps, and it even expands them. I like, for example, the conceit of all of the Shadow's agents wearing rings. I thought that was clever, even though it makes the Shadow's Girasol ring a little bit less special. I think that's neat. They have kind of a watch sign, a way to kind of signify that, oh, this guy's an agent of the Shadow, but nobody else would really notice. I dig that. I think that's a cool little upgrade that they made just for the movie. The soundtrack has to be mentioned here. It's playing in the background. It plays in the background of all of the Shadowcast episodes. Jerry Goldsmith, one of his very best soundtracks, really. My only gripe with this soundtrack is in the Cobalt Club when he's sitting down and talking to Margot Lane. And we've hired this chanteuse to sing a 30s style, like swing noir sort of croony song just before that, Some Kind of Mystery. And right after that, Lamont Cranston sits down to have dinner with Margot Lane, and all of a sudden we're listening to Kenny G smooth jazz, replete with Casio keyboard in the background.
It's the strangest thing, but I have this sudden craving for Peking duck.
That's so odd. I was thinking the exact same thing.
And you're just like, where did that come from? Suddenly it's 1987. It's like, what is this? Special mention has to be given to cinematographer Stephen Burham, who thought really, really deeply about what the look of the movie was supposed to be. Again, this feels like it's supposed to be a big budget movie, but it's not. And it needs to it's a period piece, so those are automatically going to be more expensive. So there had to be a lot of cost cutting going on here. So more traditional movie making methods had to be used.
When the Lamont Cranston character, played by Alec Baldwin, is kidnapped and taken to the Tolku's chamber, when the Tolku walks back and walks away, he walks into a silhouette, which is the shadow. In the nightclub, instead of doing some very fancy, effect about him turning into the shadow, because it was a nightclub, I thought it was organic just to have him lean back into a shadow.
Stephen Burham just has a real appreciation for the artistic elements of filming, and I think he just makes everything look beautiful. He brings out the best that he can in the quality of his film and the way he lights and angles that he chooses.
There's some bleeding edge CGI in places, some of which is aged pretty well, like a sequence with John Lone as Shiwan Khan sort of conjuring a pattern out of a rug. That still looks good. I was watching that on Blu-ray and it still looks stunning. But then, there's the dagger, which hasn't aged horrendously, but it is what it is. And there's a little effect here and there, like some of the shadows stuff that they do here and there. The invisibility in places doesn't look that great, but for the most part it looks all right. But the traditional stuff, the stuff that's done old school with in-camera effects, with tasteful lighting choices, is absolutely superb. And Stephen Burham, he actually talks a fair amount on the behind-the-scenes stuff about the exact techniques he used, and you can tell he really thought deeply about it. For the record, this guy's no slouch. St. Elmo's Fire, The Untouchables, he's won a bunch of awards, and deservedly so. Right before The Shadow, he did Carlito's Way, which also co-starred Penelope Ann Miller. So this guy knew exactly what he was doing. And honestly, of all the stuff he's done, it won't be mentioned in that company, but his work on The Shadow is at least as good, and in some cases better than his work on any of the movies I've just mentioned, even though those might be in some ways better written, better acted, better produced actual films. If I could sort of distill to its essence my impression of this movie, it's that, man, we really didn't know how good we had it. You hear a lot of grousing and complaining from the Shadow community and the fans of this property and character, saying this movie should have been so much better. Indeed, there's a lot to complain about. There are some cringy lines of dialogue here and there, one of which was actually improvised by Alec Baldwin.
In rehearsals, certain lines Alec would come up with, and they were incorporated in the script. So there's a lot of Alec in the movie.
Where he's up in Reinhardt Lane's office, and he's dueling with these Mongol warriors who are coming to steal the beryllium sphere. And they go over the edge of the balcony and land on top of a gargoyle. The Shadow uses the body of the Mongol warrior to break his fall, and immediately the camera cuts up to the Shadow kind of looking down and smirking, and he says,
"Next time you get to be on top."
It is distilled essence of cringe. It is far and away my least favorite line in the whole movie, and it totally came out of Alec Baldwin's head. But David Koepp, as I said, is a great writer, so there are some great lines that actually are in the script. I love the exchange in The Shadow's sanctum, which I'm not wild about the design of. We'll talk about that in a moment. But the actual exchange between Shiwan Khan and Lamont Cranston in The Shadow's sanctum.
That is a lovely tie, by the way. May I ask where you acquire it?
Brooks Brothers.
Is that Midtown?
45th and Madison. You are a barbarian.
Thank you.
I absolutely love that. I love the way they both play that. John Lone really shines in this movie, actually, in a weird way, and I feel like he doesn't get mentioned enough for that, personally. It's a big operatic kind of performance, and that's how I would describe it, too. It's not played the wrong way. Shiwan Khan is campy, yet you would think that would be a criticism of this performance, but it's not one that I would make, personally. He plays it big. He plays it operatic, and it's a conscious choice on his part.
It's like opera in its best sense.
So there's a lot of intensity, and it takes a tremendous concentration from all of us in order to make the effect, to make the timing, to make the drama that apparently it's much bigger than life drama. This is not about your next door neighbor struggling with some bills or disease. So this is quite fun in that sense. It's big, sumptuous looking, and big production value, and big character. Like my character is rather spacious and consuming, rather big.
It's just a sumptuous production, even though, again, as we said, kind of a shoestring budget. And that probably is what hurts this. Nothing was hurt more in terms of production, though, than, sadly, An Act of God. They had a great big ending sequence. Now, the entire climactic sequence of this movie is clearly inspired by the movie The Lady from Shanghai, an old Orson Welles film noir. In my opinion, one of the greatest movies he ever made. It was made shortly after Citizen Kane. It was when Orson Welles' career was seen to be kind of on the downslope, and the press were not very favorable to him. They were extremely uncharitable, to say the least. He kind of had a little bit of a feud going with William Randolph Hearst. So William Randolph Hearst was pulling a lot of strings to get movie critics to talk crap about Orson Welles movies, even if they were good. And The Lady from Shanghai is objectively one of the greatest movies he ever made. But you wouldn't know that from any of the reviews. However, time has been very kind to The Lady from Shanghai, such that it wound up being a huge visual reference point for the end of this movie. Right up to the floor that actually rotates and moves and lifts up, and the shadow slides down it. That's all from The Lady from Shanghai. And in a further reference to The Lady from Shanghai, we get an ending sequence that was supposed to be in a hall of mirrors. And the obvious implication there is he was supposed to be shooting at mirrors, and he's missing, and it's just a reflection, and all this is all kind of taken. There were supposed to be these quick cuts between the two characters. It was a clear visual reference to The Lady from Shanghai. Unfortunately, the filming of The Shadow was not the only major event that happened in the city of Los Angeles, in Hollywood, in the early to mid-90s. One of the big events was the Great Hollywood Earthquake. And the set, and it was a lavish mirror set that was actually built for that sequence, sadly was a casualty of that earthquake. And so if you thought this ending kind of seemed weird and sort of compressed and sort of to come out of nowhere, suddenly when they move into the other area, it's like they exist in a parallel mirror dimension. And there's no real sense of visually how they got here to this Hall of Mirrors. That clearly is a matter of exigency. That had to happen because the actual full mirror set, which to hear people tell it, I've actually seen production sketches in the behind the scenes stuff. It was pretty fabulous, and unfortunately wound up not being used because it was destroyed. The resultant version, I don't know if I'm the only one who gets this. Between the Shadow kind of throwing off, he doesn't have the hat on, he doesn't have the scarf or anything, he's just got the trench coat and the two pistols and the shoulder holsters, and Alec Baldwin's got kind of the slicked back hair. And am I the only one who gets the feeling like the creators of The Matrix looked at this sequence? They're controlling stuff with their mind, and the Shadow's in the full lean trench coat outfit, and they're kind of in this other dimension shooting like projectiles with their minds and stuff. It's very otherworldly. I definitely feel like the Wachowskis watched this movie at some point. It feels very, very Matrix. But earthquakes and other assorted production woes, I don't think were the only production-related problems here. There were some misguided actual artistic choices here. The production designer, I mentioned The Shadow's Sanctum earlier. And you just look at it, and then you compare that to descriptions of the pulp. It's supposed to be dark. It's supposed to be subdued. Really, it's just supposed to be a blue light in the middle of a room shining down on a desk, and you get these two hands that are flitting out back and forth, throughout the light and whatever. It's very mysterious. It's got that Mysterioso atmosphere. They went the other way, and this, I think, is a misstep. Even though it looks very, very cool, the production designer straight up said, he's quoted as saying, we wanted to avoid gloomy interiors in this movie, how do you make a Shadow movie and say anything like that unironically? I have no idea. And then he goes further and it gets even worse. He says, "We want the audience to feel safe every time the Shadow is on screen." Like, just what? What? This character, first off, you just built a version of the character that is supposed to be like just this side of a supervillain, right? He's struggling with this dark side of his nature, something that was never really in the Shadow's backstory. And then you want people to feel safe when he's on screen? Doesn't that kind of undermine the sort of tortured whatever version of the character that you're going? I do not understand that, really. It's a shame.
I would like to have shot it in anamorphic. I would like to have shot it in black and white. But economically, the studios want color movies. And because of all of the new special effects stuff and the new CGI stuff, the special effects companies didn't want to shoot in anamorphic because they felt it was too difficult for them. They were just afraid of it because they'd never done it in the CGI and they did not want to pioneer it.
The production in the overall is excellent. The skyline, which was a vast miniature, incredible. They called them maxatures. Weta Workshop later claimed credit for calling them bigatures, but sorry, Universal got there first. Anyways, it was this huge New York skyline set because, of course, they're not filming on location. This is on the Universal backlot. I've actually been there, seen it. It's pretty cool looking. And they had to have a miniature skyline because, of course, the skyline of New York looks very, very different. Even in 1994, it looked very different. These miniatures were so beautiful, so Art Deco. It's kind of like an exaggerated version of what 30s New York looked like. They actually wound up being reused for Gotham City in the next 2 or 3 Batman films. Batman Forever, Batman and Robin, maybe even Batman Begins might have been like touched up, I'm not sure, but certainly Batman Forever and Batman and Robin for certain. The production in general is just really, really stellar. Apart from that, they have some pretty good location shooting, some excellent sets, some excellent matte work, some excellent miniature work. I also like the amount of thought that goes into it. The idea I mentioned earlier, the rotating platform at the top of the Monolith Hotel that Shiwan Khan is on. And I thought originally, oh, that's just a reference to the lady from Shanghai. Indeed it is, but there was a little bit more thought put into it than that. They were thinking, okay, this is supposed to be a hotel. The idea is Shiwan Khan has hypnotized the entire city of New York. His secret hideout is literally invisible, and it's right smack dab in the middle of Manhattan. Okay, so the production designers are thinking, what's at the top of a hotel? Of course, his throne room is going to be at the top of a hotel. What in a utilitarian context is going to be up there? And they reasoned, oh, restaurants. That's what always goes at the top of a hotel. It's true. I've been in many, many hotels. There's usually a restaurant up there. And often, even back then in the 30s and 40s, it was a big gimmick. They would have a rotating floor. It'd be a rotating restaurant. Now, that idea is not conveyed nor hinted at even once when you're watching the movie, but you look at the behind-the-scenes interviews and stuff, you just sense there was a lot of thought that went into this movie, and then stuff just started getting cut out, whether it was for time or budget. I don't know, but that's just the prevailing sense I get watching The Shadow. In the overall, I love this movie. I go back, I've watched it dozens and dozens of times. I loved it when I finally got to see it as a young man. I've loved it as an adult my entire life. It remains one of my favorite movies, and I'll make a very controversial statement among some circles. I don't think it's controversial at all. I've seen all these movies. I'm qualified to make the judgment. Of all the so-called pulp hero movies, only a few of which are even about pulp characters, the 90s sort of pulp quartet, Dick Tracy, The Shadow, The Rocketeer, The Phantom. The Shadow outshines all of them, in my opinion. It is the best of the bunch, hands down. And I love all the others. I think The Phantom's very, very underrated. Dick Tracy is excellent. And, of course, The Rocketeer today is a bit of a cult classic. All these movies really are cult classics, but I think The Shadow is the one with the most unique style. It's the one that holds up the best. It has the strongest ensemble cast. It's a great movie, but what might have been, right? if you look into the production of this movie, you get the sense there was something piecemeal, something was left out. And so today, on this inaugural episode of the new season of the Shadowcast, we are going to explore what might have been. We are going to review the comic book adaptation of the Shadow movie by Michael Kaluta. Now, the reason why I'm reviewing this is not just because I will use absolutely any excuse under the yellow sun to review a Michael Kaluta Shadow comic, but also because we want to examine this question of, okay, what was cut out? What happened here? Was there a more faithful version of the movie at some point? And thanks to Michael Kaluta, we have that answer, because obviously when you're drawing a comic, you need some lead-in time. And so in order to prepare, in order to have the time really to illustrate this entire comic, especially an artist like Michael Kaluta, who's a little bit on the slower side, you have to have some sort of script to go off. So this is an earlier version of the script, and the differences begin immediately. And the obvious implication here is that there were much pulpier elements in this script from the very beginning, and somehow they just wound up carving all those rough edges off at some point. Because right in the opening page, we're introduced to Clyde Burke, an agent of the Shadow. Clyde Burke, at one point, reporter for the classic Shadow Agent Extraordinaire, was going to be a character in this movie. Blows my mind. Some of the other big differences, obviously Shiwan Khan looks much more like his classic self, but he's also behaving a little bit more like his classic self. Margot Lane, the telepathy stuff isn't really in the script much at all. In fact, in the very first meeting between Lamont and Margot, they have a much more intense date, right? There's kind of a moment where there's a little bit more of a push-pull in the original movie, where kind of Lamont Cranston sort of runs off and it's not quite as pronounced, the romantic aspect. Whether it's because this is a comic book adaptation and comics are by nature a much more compressed medium than film or novels or whatever, or if it's simply a difference in the original shooting script, but Lamont Cranston comes on a lot stronger, and Margot kind of says, oh, I've got a little bit of a sixth sense, but I have a feeling that I'll meet you. That's about as close as we come to Margot Lane coming right out and saying she has telepathy. So I have a feeling the earlier versions of the script just didn't have a telepathic Margot Lane. I probably should have mentioned in the movie review itself, the telepathy thing I don't think is necessary, but I don't think it hurts the movie either. Let me put it this way. Penelope Ann Miller was interviewed and talked about how the telepathy put her on the same plane as Lamont Cranston and the Shadow.
I like the fact that in their relationship that Margot could read his mind, and so she always had one on him. She was always sort of one-upping him and being able to complete his sentences.
And I gotta say, I don't see that. I think the character is on the same plane in terms of, I think Margot Lane is a well-written female character. She's an agent of action. But I don't think she has to be a telepath to kind of do that. I don't think that's a necessary element. It honestly came off more like a gimmick. It's not an offensive gimmick. It doesn't bother me. I would prefer Margot Lane in the future in comic adaptations and future movie adaptations wasn't telepathic, just because that's not the character, but it didn't bother me. Another big difference in this script that I suspect was just cut for time was during the sequence where Lamont Cranston visits Roy Tam. This is quite a while after he's saved his life, and they basically put together what Shiwan Khan's plan is, basically to build an atom bomb. In that entire sequence, the Shadow in the comic book adaptation, and so I assume in the original shooting script, has to hypnotize Roy Tam into making inferences and drawing conclusions that he wouldn't necessarily naturally have drawn. It's actually kind of fascinating, but you could see how maybe if they were shooting the movie, they would have cut that out because it would just lengthen what is essentially an expository sequence. You can kind of understand why they would cut that out. In the overall, though, it's interesting because even though it's compressed compared to the movie, I feel like other sequences get to breathe a lot more in a comic book format, and that's probably just because of Michael Kaluta being an absolute genius. I especially love the sequence in the movie. It kind of feels like a missed opportunity when the Shadow comes into conflict with the Mongol warriors in Reinhardt Lane's office, and they're kind of fighting over the beryllium sphere and everything. That whole sequence, it's cool. I've always liked that sequence in the movie, but boy, in the comic, it's so much better. The Shadow is largely wordless. It's a pure action sequence. They cut the cringe cancer clean out by removing the "you get to be on top" line out of there. I love that. That instantly improves the entire sequence. The moment where the guy actually falls to his death, instead of slipping while he was holding on to him, while the Shadow was holding on to him, he actually cuts his queue, sort of the ponytail, in the back, which is culturally really, really significant. I loved that. And actually, most of the improvements with this movie adaptation relate to Shi-Wan Khan, especially the climactic sequence, which contains very little in the way of references to the lady from Shanghai. So it makes you wonder if at the 11th hour, or even while they were shooting, they didn't decide to themselves, oh, let's make this mirror set, let's do all of this stuff, because none of that is here. In fact, there's sort of a plot contrivance about the sarcophagus that Shi-Wan Khan arrived in being the source of his power, and this results in the ultimate demise of Shi-Wan Khan. It's a very Shadow climax where he discovers the source of the enemy's power and then reverse engineers it against Shi-Wan Khan. I dig it. Honestly, this is what the climax of the film should have been. The climax we got has always felt somewhat incongruous, and I always put it down to the fact that the earthquakes destroyed that mirror set. But honestly, I feel like there was a last-minute readjustment on the climax of the film version, and now reading the comic book adaptation, and I assume the novelization is the exact same way. I've never read it, but I assume it is. Yeah, I really, really think it has more to do with the fact that the earlier scripts were just plain pulpier and more faithful to the actual source material. Either way, it comes in 2 separate issues, so it's a 2-parter. All the artwork and the writing is by Michael Kaluta. If you need an excuse to buy a Michael Kaluta Shadow comic, I don't know what to tell you. You should pick up the Shadow movie adaptation. It's not only one of the better movie adaptations I've ever read in my life in comics, it's one of the best Shadow comics that's ever been published. It's really, really good. And it's been really, really good to get back to the Shadowcast. I've enjoyed tearing into the 1994 Shadow film and its resultant comic book adaptation. I hope you pick up both. I hope you enjoy both. But most of all, until next time,
The Shadow knows.